Greetings, my excellent students. Hope you're doing really well. In this lecture, we're going to consider some theodicy ideas from the 20th century. We have finally reached the 20th century in our march through history. We've been checking out readings in an anthology form from Mark Larimore's Reader, The Problem of Evil. Bunch of voices today, some of whom might be familiar, at least their names, some of whom will not be familiar, who wrote on this theodicy problem and who are represented in the program Larimore sets out for us in his book of readings. Let's just tackle a few of them and see what they have to say. First of all, the 20th century. Go back to high school history class. What was happening in the 20th century? You had, of course, both world wars. World War I, just an incredibly destructive event that just contained what seemed to many people at the time to be an enormous amount of suffering that produced very little by way of political solutions. Indeed, there had to be a second World War, which then introduced to us the idea of nuclear warfare. And so suffering possible on levels that nobody had thought imaginable. In the 20th century, though, parallel to this, you also had movements like women's suffrage, the right to vote for women in the United States and in other places earlier. And you also had in the United States and elsewhere the civil rights movement, beginning an attempt, which we're still working at, to put people of all races and ethnicities on the same level for voting, for access to education and things like that. So on the one hand, you have enormous suffering, which could give people, probably some dour new ideas about theodicy, but also a new sense that we have to make some kind of meaning of suffering if we're to survive as people. So you've got kind of like that track going on. And then you have this other track where it's like we were beginning to realize in increasingly sophisticated and painful ways how suffering was not equally divided among people in the world, not equally divided maybe between men and women, not equally divided among the races of people. Indeed, one of these voices here, I'll just skip to this one. I'm looking at, where is this? William R. Jones, in a book called Is God a White Racist? A Preamble to Black Theology. Asks the questions in a really blunt way about the maldistribution of suffering. Points out that how some people really suffer a lot and others don't very much is an important biblical theme. You see it in the Old Testament and so on. And yeah, maybe people suffer, he admits, in order to teach them something, but then he kind of comes around and says, look, it depends. Sometimes suffering as teaching or pedagogy or suffering as testing isn't really a very helpful model. He says suffering unto death, for existence, negates any interpretation of pedagogical suffering. That is, we learn from a burn to avoid fire. This makes little sense if the learning method destroys the learner. Suffering as a form of testing is also contradicted if the amount and severity of the suffering are incommensurate with the alleged purpose. Okay. And we can also look at suffering not just individually, but in terms of in historical eras and suffering that is transgenerational. Okay. Page 364, he has this to say. It is my contention that the peculiarities of black suffering make the question of divine racism imperative. It is not my position that the special character of black suffering answers the question. What I do affirm is that black theology, precisely because of the prominence of ethnic suffering in the black experience, cannot operate as if the goodness of God for all mankind were a theological axiom. So this is a bracing challenge, certainly to white theology or to white people, to consider the experiences of others and ask, we're sitting here, maybe I as a white male am hand-wringing about the problem of suffering and so on. What about entire races of people that were confined to slavery for centuries? How do we do theodicy in the face of that? How do you look at slavery as a theodicy problem? Can you look slavery in the face and say, well, we really learn from our suffering, so hopefully the black community could learn from slavery? I don't know about you, to me that would be just a horrific, obnoxious view that we could never say, never do, never use. We can't imagine that God would allow that, and neither can Jones, the author. So it's like, do you have to then conclude that God is not good? The distribution of suffering unequally among peoples is something that people began to really contend with in the 20th century. So the reading from Jones, is God a white racist? Asks that question. Is God a white racist? Asks that question. I think a very acute, very painful, very provocative way. So too for women. The last reading in the Reader is by Nell Noddings. Nell Noddings is a famous feminist philosopher, still alive, I think, at the time of the making of this video. She says, you look at the perspective of evil from women's experience, and then, there's a lot going on. She says, look, here's the problem. She looks at ideas of theodicy that try to give it any kind of redemptive meaning, and says, these are basically flawed. This idea that God is good and infallible and all that kind of stuff. She says maybe we should leave that behind. Page 383, she's talking about Kant, and she's talking about C.S. Lewis. Kant was a major philosopher who also touched on theodicy at points. We'll mention him in another lecture. C.S. Lewis, a famous Christian writer from the 20th century. Nell Noddings says, this is page 383 in the middle, in the Christian design, faith may lighten the struggle, but the suffering is no less real. Instead of concentrating on the alleviation and possible elimination of suffering, Christians are urged to find meaning in it. However, she says, and she quotes C.S. Lewis about, finding meaning in suffering. She says, Lewis fails to appreciate the possibilities in a fallible God, a God who makes mistakes, one who controls just so much and is perhaps still struggling toward an ethical vision. This sort of God, lovable and understandable to women, may be unattractive to many men because he cannot make absolute claims on us for worship, obedience, and authority. Or if he makes such claims, we might be justified in challenging him and even charging the claim to his wicked or unfinished side. A fallible God shakes the entire hierarchy and endangers men in their relations to women, children, animals, and the whole living environment. So that's a radical suggestion, right? Against the notion that maybe God is perfect in some way or can't change or can't learn or grow, Nell Noddings says, okay, what about a God who can actually learn or change? This should be a God that would be more sympathetic to women's concerns and suffering. This idea that God would grow or change through time is not a traditional Christian theological idea. It has found a home in some theology that we might call process theology, which sees God as kind of growing up and changing along with humanity in the human experience through time. Anyway, I give you Jones and Noddings just a little taste of that to say now new questions are coming up in the 20th century about racism, about sexism, and about all kinds of things, economics, and the many experiences that people have. Okay. All right, so we've got voices like that. By the way, another voice that we could look at that's worth reading in poetic form. W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois. This is page 308 of the Reader. In 1906, there was a murderous white mob, as Larry Moore puts it in his introduction, which had, and I think the background on this is that some black men were wrongly accused of committing a crime for which there was no evidence and so on. And I think there was even a lynching. I mean, lynching right there, talking about the problem of evil. Thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of African Americans were lynched, that is like killed by mob violence in a public way in America without any due process, trial, or anything like that. I mean, consider that as a theodicy problem, It's a real challenge to some of the more traditional theodicies. Oh, well, people just kind of get what they deserve. Okay, but if they were killed as innocent victims, they did not get what they deserved. Could you read a situation like that, the lynching situation that many African American men faced throughout the late 19th and early 20th century, as an instantiation of something like Isaiah's suffering servant? Remember back in the prophetic theodicies lecture we had talked about the idea of innocent suffering as bringing about some kind of redemptive meaning. Could you use a model like that? There's a famous African-American theologian, James Cone, who had a book called The Cross and the Lynching Tree, in which he brought together the idea of Jesus on the cross as an innocent sufferer with the fate of black men who died as innocent victims of mob violence in the United States for many, many decades. Okay, and there's a lot of meaning there that could be made. I don't know, though. How comfortable do you feel making that kind of meaning? As opposed to just saying, no, it was just wrong. It's not redemptive. Nobody was redeemed. It was just gross and sick and, if there's a God, that God's going to have to answer for allowing these kinds of crimes to happen. The 20th century really brought those kinds of horrors to our consciousness. I mean, here's something we haven't even talked about too: the Holocaust. I mean, consider the Holocaust as a theodicy problem. I mean, it like breaks your mind, breaks your soul to think of the death of 12 million plus people, and then and that was just in the Nazi Holocaust version, and then after that there was in Stalinist Russia many tens of millions more died in labor camps and were executed. Maybe some of these people deserved it, but maybe not. Okay, can you go with the moral math, the kind of act-consequence nexus here? So you see these broad lines kind of shaping up. If it's not the case that suffering is deserved or serves some kind of stoic-like purpose to shape us into real men and women that we grow up, what the heck is it for? It has become, I think, morally unacceptable, and for good reasons, to say, oh, slavery, you can explain that suffering because it was actually good, or to say, oh, the Holocaust, there was a lot of suffering, but it made sense because we learned, and it was worth it because... I mean, for me, as a Christian, as a thinker, those kinds of things, as a human being, those kind of explanations just leave me feeling really grossed out morally. I can't go there. I can't go, there's like a block for me, in going into those kind of explanations. They don't work. And so say you've been a really big fan of the Stoic style Theodicies so far, where you just say, yeah, Theodicies, it kind of really makes us, suffering makes us who we are, and we got to have an antagonist and see what we're made of. How well do those work for things like the lynching of tens of thousands of black men in the United States? How well does that work for the Holocaust? I said this early on, right, in one of the lectures. With theodicy thinking, you've got to get ugly. You have to get really ugly, okay? And you have to think about the true horror that people have experienced in order to really confront the problem fairly. W.E.B. Du Bois writes a poem after experiencing in his community an event like this, a race riot, where they had to escape and many people were killed. Dozens of people were killed, pillaging, looting. He begins his poem called A Litany at Atlanta. O silent God, thou whose voice afar in mist and mystery hath left our ears a-hungered in these fearful days, hear us, good Lord. Notice that opening phrase, though, O silent God. Is God silent in the face of suffering? Where is God? How could God not stop something like this from happening? Page 309, there's some more outbursts. And yet, whose is the deeper guilt? Who made these devils? Du Bois asks. Who nursed them in crime and fed them on injustice? Who did this? Thou knowest, good God, calling God to account for being good in the traditional scheme. Wherefore do we pray? Is not the God of the fathers dead? Have not seers seen in heaven's halls thine hearsed and lifeless form stark amidst the black and rolling smoke of sin, where all long bow bitter forms of endless dead? Awake, thou that sleepest. Notice the accusations here that Du Bois makes by way of lament. God is silent. God is sleeping. Lest that sound too horrible to handle, this idea that we would accuse God of sleeping or being silent. Recall some themes, of course, from Shusaku Endo's novel Silence, covered in a previous lecture in this series. A meditation there on God's silence or seeming silence in the face of suffering. But also the words of prophets like, say, Jeremiah, for example, or Habakkuk, who just looked God in the face, as it were, and said, why, God? Where is this suffering coming from? How is this even possible? There is space in the Christian imagination to call God to account and to ask, why are you silent? The language that Du Bois uses, in fact, of God as a sleeper, of one who's sleeping, you can find that language in the Psalms. Indeed, the Psalms in the Bible have some of the most powerful theodicy language that we can find in any theological tradition. And I regret that we haven't talked about the Psalms more in these lectures, because there's so much there. This idea that God is sleeping, for instance, you could read Psalm 44. I'm turning there in a Bible now. Psalm 44, a psalm of lament, where the speaker there is lamenting all of these, things that have happened All this has come upon us, but we have not forgotten you, verse 17, or been false to your covenant. The author there is challenging the act-consequence connection, saying, we've been taunted, we've been destroyed, all kinds of things have happened to us, but we haven't forgotten the covenant. What did we do? How can you draw that line? The author of Psalm 44 ends with this cry, verse 23. Rouse yourself. Why do you sleep, O Lord? Awake. Do not cast us off forever. Why do you hide your face? Why do you forget our affliction and oppression? There we see the two charges against God, that God is asleep or that God is silent. Think of the idea of God sleeping in terms of the theodicy triangle, and you can see how deeply concerned with theodicy this psalm is and so many others. If God is all-powerful, but the innocent people are suffering, evil, right? Or, I'm sorry, let me put it the other way. If God is good, top of the triangle, but if we see innocent people suffering, what does that mean about God's power? Maybe he's not all-powerful. Maybe he would help if he was just awake. It might be psychologically easier to think that God is trying to stop evil but can't do it, or he's sleeping and he just doesn't see it, rather than thinking that he sees it and that he's just not concerned to stop it. So you see this deeply theological language in Du Bois in his poem, The Litany at Atlanta. Beautiful poem. I really like it as a lament and as a meditation on suffering in a charged racial moment in American history. Josiah Royce. There's a selection here from Josiah Royce, an American, I think it was an American philosopher. Lived on into the beginning of the 20th century. There are various things here, and you can read Joyce's portions of Joyce's essay, The Problem of Job, here from the reader. He tries to incorporate evil into a kind of view. There are some things that maybe would remind us of what I guess I keep calling the Stoic view, that evil is here, but it solves a purpose. Ultimately, he says that we need to, make sure that we endure physical pain and that we subordinate moral evil. That's what we do. We endure physical pain. It's made for our endurance. But moral evil, we have to subordinate it. We have to put it in its place. And it's there to be put in its place. Evil doesn't triumph over our world, okay? But rather, it has to be relativized for what it really is. I wanted to point out something, though, that's not even in, I don't think it's in the selection from Royce that Larimore gives us, but rather in Larimore's introduction to Royce's essay. He's talking about Royce, and he says, Royce proposed that any theodicy must pass this test. I think this is super fascinating. Would it console a mourner at a funeral? Right? Now we could go back and re-examine all of the theodicy traditions we've looked at so far throughout all of history, from Plato all the way to the 20th century, and even the theodicies we've examined from the Bible, and ask that fascinating question: does this pass the funeral test? Josiah Royce's funeral test. Could you say this theodicy at a funeral, and would it provide comfort to those in mourning? Now that's a challenging test, right? It might encourage us to bring theodicy into real life rather than just as an abstract, speculative exercise where we're thinking about other people's suffering and how would this be hypothetically, but rather asking, would this actually be a comfort? Now, admittedly, Royce's challenge of the funeral test is really difficult for thinking about the act-consequence theories of suffering, right? Because can you do this at a funeral? Can you go up and say, oh, I'm so sorry your child died in that car accident. Wish you'd been better with the seatbelts, or whatever, sounding like Rousseau about the Lisbon earthquake, or about Malthus, for example, about sex and population. Those, it's like, do you get yourself into a situation where a theodicy like that is maybe true, but it can't be spoken? Some things are like this in life. Maybe we do cause our own suffering, but in a situation of extreme pain, is it the right move to put it out there like that, right? Funerals are an amazing test of theodicy, right? They really bring it home. I know one of the last funerals I went to, it just felt so heavy. It was the death of someone's spouse. And, after the funeral, the widow, the surviving spouse was, it was almost like nobody wanted to talk to him. Like it was like there's just this like shroud of like silence and just discomfort. Because like, what do you say, right? It's hard to talk at funerals. I mean, people say the stupidest things at funerals too, like, oh, I'm sure it's all for the better, or, she's in God's hands now. And it's like, I don't know if you've ever been like a family member who's had to like be at a wake or a viewing and people come through and say this kind of stuff. I mean, you can ask yourself, right, what was comforting and what was not. Try to apply that test, though, to some of the theodicies that have been appealing to you, maybe in considering all of the readings and the ideas we've been looking at in these lectures. Do they pass the funeral test? Simone Weil, a 20th century philosopher and mystic, has a fascinating essay, which in many ways I think is a very complicated one. An essay called The Love of God and Affliction. And she kind of makes a differentiation now between suffering and affliction. So for those of you who have felt uncomfortable with just putting evil and suffering and theodicy and the goodness of God and all these categories into the same category, you might like the reading by Simone Weil, who tries to really disentangle some of these terms, talks about affliction and the suffering of the innocent. It's a mystical essay in some ways, because it's not really clear, she's asking us to see evil as page 339, for example. She says, the sea is not less beautiful in our eyes because we know that sometimes ships are wrecked by it. Sounds very Stoic, right? That idea of the bad actor in the play. On the contrary, this adds to its beauty. It is this perfect obedience that constitutes the sea's beauty. All the horrors produced in this world are like the folds imposed upon the waves by gravity. Men can never escape from obedience to God. Joy and suffering are two equally precious gifts, both of which must be savored to the full. We also have similar ideas in the essay by John Hick, The Veil of Soul-Making Theodicy. John Hick was a famous 20th century theologian who was one of the more famous theologians to really deal with theodicy. He wrote a lot about it and was very influential. His basic idea was like, look, if we wanted to live in a fairy tale land, a kind of utopian heaven on earth, of course there would be no suffering. But God is trying to make of us adults, real adults. And in that kind of world, suffering has to be allowed. Free will is a daring choice that God made to even allow it. But it was the price that was necessary to allow us to grow up and to live in the kind of world that would be worth living in. So that's the Hick style of theodicy thinking. Has some Stoic type overtones, but specifically tailored to a Christian scenario, where it's soul making. It's God is creating our souls through suffering. He's making us as we grow and as we experience pain. We're being created into real adults, worthy of love, worthy of the free will choice to choose God and be chosen by God in that sense. The only other essay I want to talk about from this set of readings in this lecture was a poem. Actually by Auden. Where is this poem? I'm going to find it. It's in here somewhere. Ah, yes. Page 327, W.H. Auden, Musée des Beaux-Arts. And this poem is a reflection on a painting. I brought a copy of it here. It's this painting by Peter Bruegel. And I'll put a link to this painting down in the comments for the YouTube version, or not the comments, but the description, so you can click on it. But if you can find it, Peter Bruegel, Brueghel, the elder, Landscape with the Fall of Icarus. So you have to really look at that painting before you read Auden's poem in here to really get sort of what he's saying. The painting has Icarus, who famously flew too close to the sun, right? He flew too close to the sun and his waxen wings were burned off. And in the painting, Icarus, you've got a farmer who's like plowing a field, and you've got a shepherd here who's got some sheep, and here's poor little Icarus, right? Icarus is just, you see his legs as he splashes into the water, and the world just seems to be going on without him. And so Auden's poem is a fascinating reflection on that. On that scene. I've now lost the reading again. Where the heck is it? Here it is. Page 327. Here's Auden's poem, Musée des Beaux-Arts. About suffering, they were never wrong, the old masters. How well they understood its human position. how it takes place while someone else is eating or opening a window or just walking dully along, how when the aged are reverentially, passionately waiting for the miraculous birth, there always must be children who did not specially want it to happen, skating on a pond at the edge of the wood. They never forgot that even the dreadful martyrdom must run its course. Anyhow, in a corner, some untidy spot where the dogs go on with their doggy life and the torturer's horse scratches its innocent behind on a tree. In Bruegel's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away, quite leisurely from the disaster. The plowman may have heard the splash, the forsaken cry, but for him it was not an important failure. The sun shone, as it had to, on the white legs disappearing into the green water, and the expansive, delicate ship that must have seen something amazing, a boy falling out of the sky, had somewhere to get to and sailed calmly on. What's the perspective then? What's the meaning? It's a poem. You have to interpret it. You can think about it. Take into account the piece of art and what you see there. What I get out of it is he's saying, suffering isn't always, suffering's so strange. Right now, as I speak this thing, there are people just writhing on their deathbeds, dying all over the world. And yet here I am. I'm just, I'm drinking my coffee. I'm eating lunch. I'm making lecture videos, Suffering's kind of always happening, but it's always happening while other things are happening too, while we just go about our lives. And that's a fascinating view of theodicy as well. It takes some of the heaviness and the pressure off of it maybe. Even those of us who experience suffering, and of course all of us will die, we've also had many moments where suffering was just so far from our minds, where we were just living in comfort or just doing the boring, basic work of just living. Maybe this is just what people do, and all we can do in the face of suffering is just live our boring, simple lives. That's what Auden seems to suggest, maybe that the old masters, the old master painters like Bruegel, understood about suffering. Anyway, thanks for listening. Take care. Bye-bye.